video of Bible Mandela effects. For more information about Mandela effects, I recommend you watch the first 3 videos to get caught up. Mandela effects are false memories that large groups of people have, and they find out later that their memories are different than what actually happened. And Bible Mandela effects are when a large group of people remember Bible verses. They've memorized them, especially the King James Version, one way, and when they look it up, they find out that it's different than what they remember. And there's 2 explanations for it. Either a lot of people have memorized the verses wrong. Theologians for 2,000 years have memorized Bible verses or used them incorrectly, or people have memorized and remember the verses correctly, but the verses are somehow being changed supernaturally. We're not just talking about translators translating them differently now. We're talking about Bibles you pull off of the shelves, especially King James. When you open them up, it doesn't read what you remember. So let's look at some examples. Revelation 22:10 says, New International Version, Then he told me, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this scroll, because the time is near. Now, all of the translations are consistent. The King James Version, these are all translations of the Bible, all the translations, even the King James, seal not the sayings of the prophecy of this book, for the time is at hand. But I remember growing up learning King James Bible that it said, seal the prophecies of this book because the time is not yet at hand. I remember it being backward. And one reason I remember it being that way is because the very next verse, verse 11, let the unrighteous continue to be unrighteous, the vile continue to be vile, let the righteous continue to practice righteousness, and the holy continue to be holy. The reason you let them continue to do that because the time is not yet here. Okay? Seal it up because the time is not yet. Let people continue to do what they do until it is the end time. And then all of a sudden I read it, and now it says that it's the end time. So I looked up in the original Greek. This is what the verse looks like in the original Greek. And he says to me, you should not set a seal upon the words of the prophecy of the scroll, for the time is near. And the key word, here it says you should not, but the key word is this, set a seal upon. That word is sphragizo, to set a seal upon. But when you look at the definition of it, what it implies is that you're putting ownership on it, like sealing it with a legal signature, the ring that a king would put on it. It attests ownership of something. And what's amazing is that with Bible Mandela effects today, when it says do not put God's seal on it, what it's implying is that be careful because the words that are in the Bible are being changed in the last days. Do not put the seal because this is not from God. So we have to be careful that God's word is supernaturally being changed. And that's what's going on. That's what this word is saying. Do not attest ownership of this to God with God's signet ring. So it's amazing to think that this verse being changed is actually signifying the development of Mandela effects in the last days. So just an amazing prophecy. Next, let's look at Matthew 26:45. So Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and through this passage, Jesus is telling his disciples not to fall asleep. But then he says, in the New International Version, he returned to the disciples and said, are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come and the Son of Man is delivered into the hands. Now, this is a fascinating Mandela effect because in the New International Version, he says, are you still sleeping and resting? The hour has come, with the idea, get back up. But then look at the New Living Translation. He came to the disciples and said, go ahead and sleep, have your rest. But look, the time has come. So in one translation, he's saying, are you still sleeping? Implying he's surprised, get up, the hour has come. But then in the New Living, go ahead and sleep, have your rest. But then the English Standard Translation, sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand. I believe this is more correct. Jesus is telling them to get up. Berean Study Bible, are you still sleeping? He's surprised. Look, have your rest later on. But look at the King James Bible. I remember it saying, are you sleeping? It's the same idea, the question mark. Get up. So he came to the disciples and said, sleep on now and take your rest. Behold, the hour has come. So the King James Bible is different than what I remember, with Jesus saying, sleep on and take your rest. New King James, it's even different. Are you still sleeping and resting? The question mark. So the question is, what's going on? So let's look at the King James Bible and see the original Greek, which says, he comes to his disciples and said to them, sleep the remaining and rest. The key word is this word remaining. When you translate it, loipos, when you translate it, it means the rest, sleep the remaining, the remainder. But it's used in many different ways, like the rest of people, the others, okay? So I believe here it's even used in one reference as far as future. So what I think he's getting at is the translation that's closest to it is he's surprised when he sees them, because in the original Greek, there is no question mark here. It's an exclamation point in the translation, but in the original Greek, there is no punctuation. So I think it's more correct to say that Jesus saying, you're asleep, you're sleeping like the other times and resting. I think that's a more accurate translation. He's surprised because he immediately tells them to get up afterwards. He wouldn't be telling them to sleep and then get up shortly thereafter. But I remember the original King James Version with Jesus saying, are you asleep? He's surprised that they're asleep. Because earlier in the passage, when you read the whole passage, he's telling them, don't fall asleep, stay awake with me. So it's inconsistent for this to be that he's telling them to rest in this passage. But the key word is loipos, the word telling him to he's surprised that they're sleeping. To actually get up, he's surprised. You are sleeping, get up. And then one more Mandela effect. Let's look at, now this is also the same thing in Mark 14:41. It's the same type thing, and it's very convoluted. Are you still sleeping and resting? But then the New Living, go ahead and sleep, have your rest. So all the translations are different as far as what the original idea is. King James, sleep on now and take a rest. So both in Matthew and in Mark, the translations are all mixed up. But the original idea was he's surprised that they are asleep. Now let's look at Mark 13:10 to wrap up this session. Very short, the gospel must first be preached to all nations. Proclaimed is the key word. And in all the translations, it's preached or proclaimed. But then look at the King James Bible. And the gospel must first be published among all nations. I never remember the word published being in the King James Bible in this passage. It's always been preached. When you look in the original in the original Greek, and unto all the nations must first be proclaimed. The word is proclaimed. When you look at the original word, caruso, to herald, to proclaim, to preach. In all of the translations that come along with that word, nowhere does it have the idea that the gospel is published. So that's another example of Mandela effects. We'll continue with more. Look up a King James Bible, especially this one, and see if you see the word published. I didn't remember that. And many people, when they look up their King James Bible, they're shocked to see that it says published instead of preached.